So today we're going to talk about the principles in the U.S. Constitution. Now we've already kind of gone over this, but we did a very broad view, and now today we're going to zoom in on three main principles of the U.S. Constitution. The very first one would be that popular sovereignty. This is a big deal. It's a huge deal. Popular means people. Sovereignty means supreme. That the people are supreme in the United States government. That people should have the right to rule themselves. We can clearly see this if we look at things like the Mayflower Compact, which the Pilgrims wrote up, their own direct democracy. If we look at the House of Burgesses, we can see where the colonists of Jamestown made their own representative democracy. And we can still see it today that people will frequently create a student government association. In a school, or they'll join their own city council, or they'll run for office somewhere. So popular sovereignty, when the people have the right to rule themselves, is a big deal. The idea of self-government is not something we should minimize here. The second one would be limited government. That government should have limits on its power, that it shouldn't be able to do everything that it possibly wants to do. And the whole idea is to prevent the masses of people from being limited by the people who have the most power. Clearly, this is stated in Article 1, in which just about everything that the one branch of the government can do, like so if the president wants to spend money, he can't just spend money without asking Congress. Well, and in Congress, they've got it broken into two different parts that not one person has all the power in the government. It's also stated with the rule of law that says that everyone has to follow the law. And a very clear example would be the Richard Nixon, the Watergate scandal, in which Richard Nixon said he was the president and therefore he did not have to listen to the courts or the police, and they came back and said, actually, yes, you do, because of the rule of law, that no one is above the government or above the Constitution, and the Constitution prevents tyranny. The third principle that we're going to talk about, there's four right here. Federalism is when the national and state governments are going to be able to share power. And this ends up being a very big deal because while we have national laws like, kidnapping is illegal. You can't do that. And that's across the country. Kidnapping, you can't steal somebody from Texas just because you want to. That's not how it works. However, states can also make laws that are going to benefit their state. For example, if you live in Colorado or Alaska, a place where they have a lot of snow and heavy winters, you're going to end up having laws that dictate the wintertime, snowmobile laws or skiing laws, or how you're supposed to drive when there's snow and that kind of stuff. However, if you live in Florida or Louisiana, you're not going to need laws about snow because you're not going to see snow very often, if ever. So while individual states can make laws, so the state of North Carolina can make a law, for example, that said, in fact, we did, North Carolina said that gay marriage was illegal. Well, then the national government came in and they said gay marriage is not illegal. So the Supremacy Clause, which is found in the Constitution in Article 6, says that the national government is supreme and that nothing is going to be higher than the U.S. Constitution. So while an individual state can make a law that says, something about in North Carolina, you can drive when you're 16. However, in different states, not every state has to follow that. It depends on what's going on in each individual state. So let's talk a little bit more about that. I'm sure you're excited. So we've got three different types of powers. First, let's look over here at express powers. Express powers are things that belong strictly to the federal government, that it is written expressly in the United States Constitution. It says Congress has the power to, And then I have some examples for you. Let's come over here. Maintaining the army, that Congress is responsible for maintaining the army. Declaring war is something that it says that Congress has the explicit right. It is written down expressly in the Constitution that Congress can declare war. Congress is in charge of the U.S. postal system. Congress is in charge of immigration, and Congress has the power to coin, which means like to manufacture currency or money in America. So these are things that are written expressly in the Constitution, hence being called expressed powers. Now, reserve powers are powers that belong to states. These powers are like kind of like reserve seating. These powers are given explicitly. This says that states have these rights. So examples include trading within a state, that states get to decide what can go from one side of the state to the other side of the state. And so with that, states get to control roads. So if you live in, New York, New York roads are going to be different, very different than how they are in North Carolina. Schools are set up. So what we learn in each state. So because I live in North Carolina, my students are supposed to learn about the North Carolina Constitution. However, if you lived in another state, I'm sure they wouldn't learn about the North Carolina Constitution. Rules for marriage. So in North Carolina, you have to pay $50 in order to get a license, in order to get married. It also, whenever we're talking about marriage, we're also talking about divorce. And so how long do you have to be separated in the state of North Carolina that's 1 year. You have to be legally separated for 1 year. So you have to go fill out paperwork and be officially separated for a year before you can actually get divorced. But that's a North Carolina thing. That is certainly not how every state works. It also talks about licenses. And licenses would describe something like, of course, driver's licenses, but there's also cosmetology licenses, pilot licenses, teaching licenses, all different types. And so just because I'm qualified to teach in North Carolina and say I wanted to be a teacher in Virginia, I would have to go take their licensure or take a test in Virginia and be able to pass that in order to teach in order to get a Virginia teaching license. All right. And then the third one would be concurrent powers. Now, concurrent means shared. So that these are powers that federal and state both have. And that would involve things like taxes. Taxes are things that, unfortunately, we all have to pay. My daddy used to say that there's only two things that are certain, death and taxes. And so not only does the federal government tax us, but the state also taxes us. Now, the federal government can borrow money, and they do. People frequently talk about how we've borrowed money from other governments. But they also borrow money from states, and they also borrow money from the American citizens. And North Carolina could also borrow money. States and the federal government can set up courts. So there's a federal court and there are state courts. Just like there are federal prisons and state prisons. If you commit a state crime, that's very different than committing a federal crime. So say you commit a felony in the state of North Carolina, that could be something as, in North Carolina, it's a felony to assault a police dog. Well, that would mean that you would go to a North Carolina prison. However, if you kidnap somebody, which is a federal felony, then that means once you've kidnapped them and you get caught, that you would go to a federal prison. That's federalism, the idea that we have got federal powers, we've got state powers, and we also have some shared powers that go in between. The fourth principle that we're going to talk about, and this one is the longest one. I know you're thinking, oh, that's not long, but you got to look at the back of your paper. The separation of powers. Now, this idea came from Baron de Montesquieu, and he said, let's have a legislative, an executive, and a judicial. And the whole intent was to keep one group of people, one person, from being a tyrant, from abusing their power. So that brings us over to this. This is probably the best way to organize this, we've figured out. So that up here at the top, we've got the legislative branch, and their main responsibility is to make the law. Over here on the bottom left, we have the executive branch, and now they are supposed to enforce the law. And then we have the judicial branch, which is supposed to read the law and figure out what it's saying. Is it fair or not fair? Now, it's much broader than this, and in the U.S. Constitution, they get very specific. So we're going to go through each one of these. So you're going to have to bear with me, write small. So, for example, if we look at this blue line over here, the executive branch has the ability to suggest a law. Like, for example, Obama suggested the Affordable Care Act, which has got an AKA of Obamacare. So he suggested a law to them, and then they can come back and they can either decide to pass the law or to not pass the law. So just because the president suggests a law, for example, Donald Trump wants to get rid of Obamacare. However, Congress has been unable to repeal and replace with the American Care Act. So while they're trying to pass that, they've been unable to do it. And Donald Trump recently has said that he is going to give up on it and he's just going to let Obamacare just implode. So when he's saying that, he's saying he wants it to explode from the inside out. The president is also responsible for writing the budget. And so once he writes this budget, it's just a suggestion, because once he writes it, he sends it to Congress, and Congress is responsible for actually passing the budget. So the president cannot spend a dime until Congress says it's okay. An example of that would be, for when Obama came in and he said that he was going to make it so that, a lot of people are resentful of Michelle Obama because of the whole food and the cafeteria thing, eating healthy. And that didn't really go over as well as she had hoped. I don't think, because most students really seem to dislike what she's done. But it's still, if we look in the cafeteria, that food is really not all that different from what happened before. I mean, you may be eating pizza that's got whole wheat bread underneath it, but it's still pizza. So she didn't really get the funding that she wanted, even though the president suggested it, she didn't really get it. Another example would be Donald Trump, who has suggested in his budget to have the wall built between Mexico and America. And again, that is not something that's really working all that well. So just because the president suggests something doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually going to happen. Although there are things that do happen. And we've got some other examples that we're going to talk about in some later units. The president can suggest the law right here. Once he suggests the law, Congress could then pass the law. Well, then, if the president doesn't have to suggest all the laws. The Congress can, once they make those laws, they send them to the president, and he can do one of three things. He can veto it. Now, veto means no. So if your mom vetoes your weekend plans, and that means she's saying, no, you cannot go. Now, the president can also sign that law into action, which means yes, or the president can pocket veto. Now, pocket veto, spelled exactly how it sounds. You ready to write this definition? Pocket veto means to set it aside in the hopes that that the president does not have to make a decision one way or the other on it. Because if Congress this is kind of confusing, but if Congress is in session after 10 days, then the bill automatically becomes law if the president has pocket vetoed it. Now, if Congress is not in session, meaning they went home, then after 10 days, then the bill dies. So this could be a way for the president to get around an especially complicated decision, like say, oils or gun laws or something, where it's no matter what he does, he's going to upset somebody. Now, if the president does veto or pocket vetoes a law, then that means Congress can override that veto with a 2/3 vote. So even if Congress makes a great law, the president says no, just because one man or woman says no does not necessarily mean that that's the end-all be-all. If Congress still decides to override it, then they can. This does not happen very much so, because Congress does want, typically, they used to, Congress does generally want to get along with the president and vice versa. The president is responsible for telling the troops where to go. But on the other hand, Congress is responsible for declaring war. So if the president sends troops That doesn't necessarily mean that we have declared war. Declaring war is a very official stance, and that comes with money because it's very expensive to have war. We're going to talk about that more later. The president can also, if you notice, these are all the things that the president, the executive, can do to Congress, can call special sessions of Congress. So the president can say, y'all get your butts back up here. George Bush did that after 9/11 happened. Congress was not in session, and so George Bush said, y'all get your tails back up here. We have, a catastrophe on our hands. One of the biggest things is that whenever the president makes appointments, that would be another thing, that the president makes appointments. Now, I'm not talking about hair appointments. I'm talking about him saying, hey, you, I want you to be a judge, or I want you to be, my attorney general or secretary of state. The Senate is responsible for approving those appointments. And if they do not approve those appointments, then the president has got to appoint somebody else and say, oh, that one didn't work. I need somebody else. The Senate is also responsible for approving treaties. So the president is going to be the person who's going to make an agreements with other countries, and the Senate has to say whether those agreements are okay or not. And if they don't, that can be really kind of embarrassing. That actually happened to one of our presidents, that he went after World War II. He went over, Woodrow Wilson went over to Europe, and they came up with a great plan called the Marshall Plan, and it was a treaty. And he came back, and all the rest of the countries in Europe had agreed to it. And he came back and he presented it to the U.S. Senate, and they said no. How embarrassing. The whole world. It's really embarrassing. They can also, Congress is responsible for impeaching the president. Now, most people think they know what this means. However, impeach means to accuse. So if I accuse you, if I impeach you of being late, I'm not kicking you out. I'm just saying, hey, you're tardy to my class. I'm just accusing you of this. Impeachment has a two-part process. It can't just, boom, happen. So the very first thing is that Congress, or the House of Representatives, the House of Representatives, which is in the legislative branch, will come and they will accuse the president, just like they did with Bill Clinton. They accused the president, President Clinton, of lying under oath. He had said that he did not have sexual relations with that woman, and they said, you are lying about this. And now, just because they accused him doesn't mean that he's leaving office. So the president was accused by the House, and then the second part of this is that the Senate is going to have a trial. Now, the Chief Justice is going to preside over that, in which evidence is going to be brought forward, and the Senate is going to be your jury, if you will. So while Bill Clinton was impeached by the House, he was acquitted, which means found innocent of the charges by the Senate. So Bill Clinton was impeached, but he wasn't kicked out of office, and that's because he wasn't found guilty of the charges. Now, what can the president do to the judicial branch? It gets a lot simpler. The green one right here, our legislative branch, has got the most power out of all of them. So our executive branch, he appoints judges. So he decides who's going to be over here. And once these people get over here, they're there for life, which is why the president gets to appoint people, which he's probably going to like them, which means like Donald Trump is going to appoint people who are going to be pretty Republican. Barack Obama appointed people who were pretty Democratic. However, the Senate still must approve those appointments. So it's kind of like all three branches have to get involved in this. The president is also responsible for forgiving somebody's sentence. So say, like O.J. Simpson, we just talked about him recently in the amendments video. O.J. Simpson was found guilty of stealing his own memorabilia. And so O.J. Simpson was put in prison for this. Well, he could write an appeal, or his lawyers probably would ask the president to pardon him. And pardon, like if you were in a grocery store and you said, pardon me, that means to forgive me. I'm sorry I got in your way. But if O.J. Simpson were to write the president and say, please pardon me, he's asking for one person to be forgiven. Now, a reprieve is a postponement. So the president can issue reprieves to prisoners. So that say like their mother was dying of a terrible illness, or if someone was pregnant and they're about to go into prison, he can issue a reprieve and say you don't have to go quite yet. He can also do a commute, and that means to shorten your sentence. So say you were given 20 years in prison, he could commute it, which means he could shorten it down to about 10 years, and then he could declare amnesty. Now, amnesty and pardon are very similar because pardon means to forgive one person, but amnesty is when you forgive a whole group. So if I declared amnesty on my class of 36 students because they didn't do their homework, then I could forgive the whole group and say I'm not going to count that homework assignment. But I've never done that, so. Now, what can the judicial branch do back? They only have one power that they can do, which means if you only have one cool power, it better darn well be a good power. And so the judicial branch's cool one singular power means that they can look at the president and they can say, that what you're doing is illegal. Another way of saying that would be that the executive is doing something unconstitutional. Now, this one power is also the very same power that the judicial branch has over Congress. They can declare laws unconstitutional. So, several years back, the United States government made it illegal or the U.S. Congress made a law and said that guns were not allowed in schools. And the United States, somebody sued over this, and the United States court system said, actually, states get to decide things like schools, and states get to decide commerce, trade inside each individual state. So they declared that law unconstitutional, that was an illegal law. Now, some people are still sitting there thinking, why should you have guns in schools? And some people are saying, of course you should have guns in schools. And that's what we're going to talk about in the very next unit, which I'm very excited about. Now, if that is the only thing that the judicial branch does, then the very last thing that we've got to talk about would be what can the legislative branch do to the judicial branch? The Senate is going to approve those judges, just like we talked about over here. That is something that is a power that the legislative has. So you can't make it into the judicial branch unless somebody over here likes you and you've got 51 people over here liking you. Because in the Senate you have 100 people, and so you have to have a clear majority, 51%, to determine whether or not you're going to be a judge or not. The legislative branch also decides how many courts and judges there are. So if the legislative branch says, no, we only want to have 5 people on the U.S. Supreme Court, then that would make it so that the judicial branch wouldn't have as many people there. Now, the legislative branch can also impeach judges, and just like over here, it is a 2-part process in which the House is going to accuse and the Senate is going to have the trial. The legislative branch can also amend the Constitution. Amend, hopefully you remember what that means, but if you don't, amend means to change the Constitution. And so say the judicial branch declares a law unconstitutional, Congress can come back in and they can change the Constitution and make it constitutional. Now, in order to do that, they have got to get either 2/3 of the states have to say, hey, here's an idea, here's a law for an amendment, or an amendment, not a law. Either 2/3 of the states or 2/3 of Congress have got to come together and say that they want to amend or to change the Constitution. Now, that's just to propose it. Now, what happens if we want to get that approved? Because just because you propose to a girl doesn't mean that she has to say yes. So proposing is 2/3 versus ratifying or approving. You have to have 3/4 of states or 3/4 of states at a convention. And so I know that sounds like a lot, but hopefully you can rewind and make sure you get all that down. Because to amend the Constitution after the judicial branch has said, you can't do that, it's not in the Constitution, and the legislative says, actually, we're going to put it in there, then you really can't do anything else. Making it so that the legislative branch is the most powerful branch of all 3 branches. All right, so that's it for today.